The darkness of space above Earth's moon suddenly cracked open like a broken mirror. Something massive pushed through from another dimension, bringing with it the kind of cold that freezes souls. This was Velnara, a creature older than most. Stars, shaped like a mountain of black glass that seemed to absorb light itself. Purple lightning danced across its surface as it settled into orbit, casting eerie shadows on the lunar surface below. Every alarm in the solar system started screaming at once. Space stations from Mercury to Pluto lit up their warning systems as sensors tried to make sense of what they were detecting. The readings made no sense. Energy signatures that broke their instruments, gravitational distortions that shouldn't exist, radio waves that seemed to whisper in languages no human had ever heard. On mining station Beta 3, orbiting in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, the day shift was just getting started. The station was nothing fancy, just a collection of metal modules bolted together around a massive ore processing facility. It smelled like machine oil and recycled air, and the artificial gravity made everything feel slightly wrong. But it was home to 300 workers who spent their days pulling precious metals from floating rocks. Park Min-ho had been working there for 6 years, long enough that the constant hum of the processes had become like background music. He was the kind of engineer who could diagnose a problem just by listening to how a machine breathed. This morning, he was fine-tuning the calibration on Processing Unit 7, which had been running a little rough lately. The work required complete focus, adjusting microscopic settings that could mean the difference between extracting 90% of a rock's valuable materials or only 80%. The proximity alarms started blaring around him, red lights, flashing across every screen in the control room. Most people would have jumped, maybe run to the nearest window to see what was happening. Minho just glanced up at the nearest monitor, saw the cascade of warnings scrolling past, and went back to his calibrations. He had seen false alarms before. Space was full of weird stuff that made sensors go crazy. Solar flares, electromagnetic storms, chunks of metal that reflected signals in strange ways. But this was different. This was Velnara unleashing its first wave of psychological warfare. The same technique it had used to break the minds of 1,000 different species across the galaxy. The entity had perfected this attack over millions of years. It was designed to reach into the deepest part of a thinking creature's brain and activate every fear they had ever felt. The terror of being alone in the dark, the helplessness of facing something infinitely more powerful than yourself, the crushing knowledge that your entire civilization was about to become a footnote in cosmic history. The wave hit Earth's solar system like an invisible tsunami. On Mars, a geology team stopped their excavation and stared at the sky, feeling suddenly cold. On the Jupiter mining platforms, workers found themselves checking and rechecking their equipment, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Even on Earth itself, people paused in their daily routines, looking over their shoulders for threats that weren't there. But Minho just frowned and tapped his console twice. The readings on his screen were fluctuating in a pattern he had never seen before. The ore processor's sensors were picking up some kind of interference that was throwing off his calibration work. He muttered something under his breath about communication arrays acting up again and reached for his diagnostic tools. In his mind, this was just another technical problem that needed solving, like a clogged filter or a miscalibrated sensor array. Velnara couldn't believe what it was experiencing. For the first time in its ancient existence, a species wasn't immediately falling to their knees in terror. The cosmic entity decided to turn up the intensity, pouring more of its dark energy into the psychic attack. It reached deeper into its arsenal of horrors, broadcasting nightmares directly into human minds across 3 different planets. The visions it sent were the stuff of madness. Entire galaxies being consumed by darkness, stars dying one by one until only cold emptiness remained. Civilizations screaming as they were erased from existence. These weren't just scary pictures, they were experiences so real that most creatures couldn't tell the difference between the vision and reality. The Zephyrian Empire, with all their advanced technology and warrior culture, had lasted exactly 47 seconds before their emperor surrendered unconditionally. The crystal beings, of Andromeda Prime had simply turned to dust when the visions hit them, but something strange happened across human space. Instead of panic and surrender, something else kicked in. Emergency protocols. The boring, methodical procedures that humans had developed over centuries of dealing with disasters. Alarm systems activated automatically. Communication networks switched to emergency frequencies. Backup power systems came online. It was like watching a giant machine respond to a malfunction, each part doing exactly what it was designed to do. On Mars Colony 7, the agricultural domes were having a typical morning. The red planet's thin atmosphere meant that all food had to be grown in carefully controlled environments, massive greenhouse structures that created their own little worlds of Earth-like conditions. The work was delicate and constant. Plants needed attention every day, regardless of what else might be happening in the solar system. Kim Nari had been working in the hydroponic gardens since before sunrise, which on Mars lasted about 24 hours and 37 minutes. She was the kind of person who talked to her plants while she worked, believing they grew better when they felt cared for. This morning, she was focused on the tomato section, where several plants were showing signs of nutrient deficiency that needed immediate attention. The wave of cosmic dread hit her like a physical force. For a moment, her hands shook as images of universal destruction flooded her mind. She saw worlds burning, heard the screams of dying civilizations, felt the crushing weight of infinite darkness pressing down on her consciousness. Any normal person might have collapsed right there among the tomato plants, overwhelmed by visions of horror beyond human comprehension. Instead, Nari took a deep breath, the way her grandmother had taught her to do when she felt overwhelmed. She counted to 10, focusing on the feeling of soil between her fingers and the familiar smell of growing things. The visions were still there, playing at the edges of her mind, but they seemed somehow less important than the yellow leaves on the plant in front of her. These tomatoes were going to feed people, real people who needed real food to survive on this red, hostile planet. She continued her pruning work, carefully removing diseased leaves and checking each plant for signs of pest damage. The atmospheric processes that maintained the dome's environment were making weird noises, probably affected by whatever was causing these strange visions. That was definitely something that needed to be reported. Command, this is Greenhouse. Delta, she said into her comm unit, her voice steady and professional. She had been trained to report any anomalies, no matter how small or strange. Something's affecting the atmospheric processes. The humidity controls are fluctuating outside normal parameters. She paused, glancing up through the transparent dome at the massive dark shape that now dominated the Martian sky. Also, there's a really big scary thing outside. Should I file a separate report for that, or can I just add it to today's maintenance log? Velnara was getting seriously frustrated now. In all its millions of years of existence, traveling from star to star and feeding on the terror of countless civilizations, nothing like this had ever happened before. Every species it had encountered followed the same predictable pattern. First came the fear, then the panic, then the desperate attempts to bargain or hide, and finally, the complete surrender. It was as reliable as gravity. But these humans were breaking all the rules. They were treating the most terrifying force in the galaxy like a minor inconvenience, something to be filed away in their bureaucratic systems and dealt with during regular business hours. This was unacceptable. Velnara decided it was time to make a more direct statement. The ancient entity gathered its power and focused all of its attention on Earth's orbital installations. These were humanity's furthest outposts, the places where they were most vulnerable and isolated. If it could break the humans here, far from their home planet, the terror would spread back to Earth like wildfire. Velnara began to manifest its physical form directly above Lunar Base, the largest human installation on Earth's moon. The process was difficult and energy-intensive, but the entity was determined to make an impression that these stubborn creatures couldn't ignore. Its shape began to solidify in the vacuum of space, becoming visible to the naked eye for the first time. What emerged was something that hurt to look at directly. A writhing mass of absolute darkness that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human mind could process. Parts of it appeared to be inside out, while other sections folded in on themselves in ways that made no geometric sense. It was like looking at a three-dimensional shadow of something even more terrible that existed in higher dimensions. The entity's surface rippled and shifted constantly, never settling into any recognizable form. Lunar Base was humanity's most important research facility, a sprawling complex of interconnected domes and tunnels built into the moon's rocky surface. It housed nearly 2,000 scientists, engineers, and support staff who were working on everything from deep space exploration to advanced manufacturing techniques that could only be done in low gravity. Base Commander Lee Jun was in his office on the observation deck, reviewing the morning's supply reports while enjoying his first cup of coffee. The coffee was one of the few luxuries they still imported from Earth, and he savored it as he watched the sun rise over the lunar horizon. At 52 years old, he had been running Lunar Base for almost a decade, and he had seen just about everything that space could throw at them. When Velnara's form began materializing outside the reinforced windows, June paused with his coffee cup halfway to his lips. The dark mass was growing larger and more defined by the second, blocking out the stars behind it. He had to admit it was certainly impressive. The entity's presence was causing interference with the base's instruments, and he could feel something pressing at the edges of his mind, trying to fill his thoughts with images of destruction and despair. "That's new," he commented to his aide, who was standing nearby with a tablet full of scheduling updates. The young woman followed his gaze and nodded thoughtfully, as if they were discussing an interesting weather pattern rather than a cosmic horror that defied the laws of physics. Then Velnara spoke directly into his mind. The voice was like the sound of dying stars, a cosmic whisper that carried the weight of eons. It demanded immediate and complete submission, threatening to erase not just Lunar Base, but all of human civilization if its commands were not obeyed instantly. June listened, politely, finished his sip of coffee, and then activated his comm unit with the same casual efficiency he used for all base communications. "Unknown entity, this is Lunar Base Control," he said in his standard professional tone. "You're currently in violation of restricted airspace. Please state your intentions or prepare to be escorted out by security." Velnara was completely confused. Now, in all its eons of existence, it had never encountered anything like this. Every other species in the galaxy had reacted exactly as expected when faced with cosmic horror. They screamed, they begged, they tried to run, or they simply shut down completely. But these humans were treating it like a minor technical problem that could be solved with the right paperwork. The ancient entity decided it needed to understand what it was dealing with. Using its vast psychic abilities, Velnara reached out and began infiltrating Earth's data networks. The planet was covered in a web of electronic communications, billions of devices all talking to each other constantly. It was like stepping into a river of pure information. What the entity found there was absolutely fascinating and completely baffling. Human history was filled with contradictions that made no sense to a logical cosmic mind. These creatures had survived ice ages that should have wiped them out completely. And what did they do during those frozen millennia? They painted pictures on cave walls, beautiful, intricate artwork created in the depths of winter when they should have been focused entirely on finding food and staying warm. They had fought massive world wars that killed millions of their own kind, conflicts so brutal that entire cities were reduced to rubble. And what did they do in the middle of these devastating conflicts? They composed symphonies, they wrote poetry, they fell in love and got married, and argued about whether their local sports teams were better than their neighbors' sports teams. The entity discovered records of humans facing asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, and plagues that killed huge portions of their population. And through it all, they kept doing the most mundane, ordinary things. They kept going to work. They kept taking care of their children. They kept making jokes and complaining about the weather and debating whether putting pineapple on pizza was acceptable. It was like watching a species that had collectively decided that the universe's attempts to kill them were just background noise to be ignored while they got on with the important business of living their lives. Velnara decided to focus on one individual human to study more closely. It chose Choi Hana, a shuttle pilot, who was currently navigating through one of the most dangerous debris fields in the solar system. She was flying a cargo run from the mining stations around Jupiter back to Mars, threading her small ship through chunks of rock and metal that could destroy her vessel if she made even the smallest mistake. The debris field around Jupiter was like a three-dimensional minefield that stretched for millions of kilometers. It was created by centuries of mining operations, failed orbital mechanics experiments, and the occasional ship that didn't quite make it through safely. Flying through, it required absolute concentration and perfect timing. Most pilots needed complete silence and total focus to make the journey successfully. But as Velnara watched through her mind, Hana was doing something that seemed impossible. She was completing her supply run checklist with methodical precision, checking off item after item as she guided her ship through the deadly obstacle course, and she was humming. An old song from her childhood, something her mother used to sing while cooking dinner. The entity could sense its own presence pressing against her consciousness, filling the edges of her thoughts with visions of cosmic dread and universal destruction. But instead of terror or awe, Velnara found something it had never encountered before in any sentient species. Hana was genuinely annoyed, not scared, not impressed, annoyed, because this cosmic entity's dramatic appearance was causing interference with her navigation systems, and that was going to make her late for her delivery schedule. She had 3 more stops to make before she could head home, and she was already behind because of equipment delays at the last station. Velnara had reached its breaking point. Enough of this subtle psychological warfare that seemed to bounce off these impossible humans like raindrops off a window. It was time for a direct approach. The ancient entity gathered its power and began the complex process of materializing its physical form inside Lunar Base itself. This was not something Velnara did lightly. Manifesting in physical reality required enormous amounts of energy, and it made the entity vulnerable in ways that existing purely as cosmic consciousness did not. But these humans had pushed it to desperate measures. If they wouldn't respond to fear, maybe they would respond to the undeniable reality of a cosmic horror standing right in front of them. The main docking bay of Lunar Base was a massive chamber carved directly into the moon's rock, reinforced with layers of metal and transparent aluminum that could withstand micrometeorite impacts and the occasional accident during ship landings. It was currently empty, except for a few maintenance vehicles and the usual collection of tools and spare parts that accumulated in any working space. As Velnara began to manifest, the very air inside the docking bay started to change. The lights flickered and dimmed as the entity's presence interfered with the electrical systems. Metal support beams groaned under stresses that shouldn't exist, bending slightly as reality itself warped around the materializing cosmic horror. The temperature dropped noticeably, and frost began forming on surfaces despite the environmental controls working at full capacity. What emerged was something that human eyes were never meant to see. Velnara's physical form was like a living contradiction, existing in dimensions that folded back on themselves. Parts of it appeared solid, while other sections seemed to be made of crystallized darkness. It towered nearly to the ceiling of the docking bay, its surface rippling with energies that made the air itself shimmer and distort. Song Hyun had been working in the maintenance tunnels beneath the docking bay when his instrument started going crazy. He was Lunar Base's chief maintenance engineer, a man who had spent 23 years keeping complex systems running in one of the most hostile environments humans had ever tried to call home. He knew every pipe, wire, and circuit in the base better than he knew his own apartment back on Earth. When the environmental alarms started sounding, his first thought was that they had another coolant leak in the primary life support system. It wouldn't be the first time. The base was getting old, and some of the original equipment was showing its age. He grabbed his toolkit and climbed up through the access tunnel that led to the main docking bay, expecting to find a ruptured pipe or a malfunctioning atmospheric processor. What he found instead was a cosmic entity that defied every law of physics he had ever learned. But Song Hyun was the kind of man who approached problems methodically. He looked up at the towering form of Velnara, noted the way the lights were flickering and the metal was groaning, and immediately started diagnosing the situation like he would any other technical malfunction. "You're leaking some kind of energy," he observed, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone he used when explaining problems to junior technicians. He gestured with his handheld scanner, which was displaying readings that made no sense but were definitely outside normal parameters. It's interfering with our life support systems. The atmospheric processes are struggling to maintain proper oxygen levels, and you're putting stress on the structural supports that they weren't designed to handle. He paused, considering the situation with the same practical approach he brought to all maintenance issues. Can you dial it back a bit? I mean, I can compensate with backup systems for a while, but if you keep this up, we're going to have some serious problems. Velnara, which had reduced entire civilizations to madness with its mere presence, found itself genuinely confused. This human was treating it like a malfunctioning piece of equipment that needed adjustment, not a cosmic force of destruction that had terrorized the galaxy for millions of years. The entity spoke directly into Hyun's mind, its voice carrying the weight of dying stars and the cold emptiness between galaxies. It demanded to know why this human showed no fear, why he didn't tremble before the awesome power that had brought kingdoms to their knees. Hyun shrugged, the way he did when asked, to explain something obvious. I've got 3 kids in university and a mortgage on a house back on Earth. You're scary, sure, but you're not student loan debt. Velnara was becoming desperate for answers. This was completely unprecedented in its vast experience. Never before had a species responded to its presence with such casual indifference. The entity needed to understand what made these humans so different from every other intelligent life form it had encountered across the galaxy. The ancient being decided to seek out someone who studied life itself, hoping that a scientist might be able to explain this biological anomaly. It chose Titan Station, one of humanity's most remote research outposts, orbiting around Saturn's largest moon. The station was dedicated to studying extremophile organisms, creatures that could survive in conditions that would kill most other forms of life. Dr. Im Sujin had been working at Titan Station for 8 years, studying microorganisms that thrived in the methane lakes below. Her research was groundbreaking work that could revolutionize how humans understood life in the universe. She was the kind of scientist who could spend 14 hours straight peering into a microscope, completely absorbed in watching single-celled organisms go about their daily business. When Velnara began manifesting in her laboratory, the effects were immediate and dramatic. The entity chose to appear as a swirling vortex of dark matter, a concentrated storm of cosmic energy that bent light around itself. The very air in the lab began to vibrate as the entity's presence warped the fundamental forces that held matter together. Glass equipment throughout the laboratory started shattering as Velnara spoke. Its voice created harmonics that resonated at frequencies no human throat could produce, sounds that seemed to come from the space between atoms themselves. Test tubes exploded in cascading chains, delicate instruments cracked and split, and the reinforced windows looking out at Titan's orange atmosphere developed spiderweb patterns of fractures. "I am the end of worlds," Velnara proclaimed, its voice causing the remaining intact glassware to ring like bells. "I have watched civilizations rise and fall like waves on a cosmic shore. Entire species flee at my approach, abandoning their homes, their cultures, everything they hold dear. The crystalline hierarchies of Vega dissolve themselves rather than face my judgment. The machine collective of Proxima Centauri shut down their consciousness and went dormant for 10,000 years. The entity's form pulsed with frustrated energy, dark matter swirling faster as its confusion grew. Yet you humans continue your mundane tasks, as if I were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. You file reports about my presence. You complain about schedule delays. You ask me to turn down my cosmic emanations because they interfere with your equipment. Why do you not fear me?" Dr. Sujin looked up from her microscope, where she had been examining a particularly interesting sample of methane-based bacteria. Her glasses had been knocked slightly askew by the vibrations from Velnara's voice, and she pushed them back into place with the automatic gesture of someone who had been wearing them for decades. She considered the question seriously, the way she approached all scientific inquiries. This was clearly an important moment, possibly first contact with an alien intelligence, and she wanted to give a thoughtful answer. After a moment of reflection, she stood up from her workstation and pulled up a second chair, gesturing for the cosmic entity to make itself comfortable. "Well," she said, settling back into her seat with the relaxed posture of someone preparing for a long discussion, "fear's just an emotion. It's a biochemical response designed to help us survive immediate physical threats, but it doesn't actually change what needs to be done." She gestured around the laboratory, where broken glass sparkled among the sophisticated equipment. "The lab cultures still need feeding every 12 hours, regardless of how I'm feeling about it. The data from today's experiments still needs to be analyzed and recorded. The bacterial samples I collected yesterday are still waiting to be catalogued and stored properly." Sujin leaned forward slightly, warming to her subject the way scientists did when discussing their work. "You being here, no matter how cosmically significant that might be, doesn't make my research less important. These microorganisms might hold the key to understanding how life can exist in extreme environments throughout the universe. That work doesn't stop just because something scary shows up." She paused, then added with a slight smile, "Besides, I've been studying extremophiles for years. You're definitely the most extreme life form I've ever encountered, but the basic principle is the same. Life finds a way to adapt and continue, no matter what the universe throws at it." Dr. Sujin's explanation was like a key turning in a lock that had been stuck for millions of years. For the first time, Velnara began to grasp something fundamental about these strange creatures. Other species in the galaxy had evolved to survive, which made perfect sense. When faced with overwhelming danger, they either fought, fled, or submitted. These were logical responses that had served countless civilizations well. But humans had evolved something completely different. They had developed the ability to persist, to keep functioning normally, even when everything around them was falling apart. It wasn't just survival, it was something much more stubborn and illogical. They would continue doing their jobs even when the world was ending, not because they didn't understand the danger, but because someone had to keep the lights on. The entity decided to test this theory by visiting another human outpost. The Mars Communication Relay Station was a critical facility that managed all data traffic between Earth and the outer colonies. It was a small station with only a dozen crew members, but it handled billions of messages every day. If this facility went down, the entire human communication network would be severely disrupted. Communications Officer Yu Daeun was working the night shift when Velnara arrived. He had been at the station for 2 years, and he knew every piece of equipment like it was part of his own body. The work required constant attention because space was full of interference that could disrupt signals. Solar flares, cosmic radiation, electromagnetic storms, and the occasional piece of space junk could all cause problems that needed immediate fixing. When Velnara manifested in the control room, it decided to pull out all the stops. The entity filled the small space with visions of galactic destruction that were so intense they seemed more real than reality itself. Daeun could see entire star systems being consumed by darkness, civilizations screaming as they were erased from existence, the cold emptiness that would remain when all life in the universe had been extinguished. Most beings would have been reduced to gibbering madness by these visions. The mental images were designed to overwhelm any conscious mind with the sheer scope of cosmic horror. But Daeun just blinked a few times, rubbed his eyes like he was trying to clear away sleep, and turned back to his control panel. He was in the middle of realigning 3 communication satellites that had drifted slightly out of position. It was delicate work that required precise timing and careful adjustment. The visions of universal destruction were definitely distracting, but the satellites weren't going to fix themselves. The morning shift would be furious if they came in to find the communication network running at reduced efficiency. "Look," Daeun said without turning around from his workstation, his fingers dancing across the control interface as he made micro-adjustments to satellite positioning. "You can destroy everything if you want. I'm not going to try to stop you. I'm just a communications tech, not a space marine or a diplomat or whatever." He paused to check the signal strength readings, noted that satellite number 7 was still slightly off target, and made another small correction. "But could you maybe wait until after my shift? I've got 3 more satellite alignments to complete, and honestly, my replacement doesn't know the system as well as I do. If I leave these unfinished, he's going to spend half his shift trying." to figure out what I was doing, and then the whole network is going to run like garbage for the next 12 hours. Velnara was stunned. Here was a human who was acknowledging the entity's power to destroy everything, but asking it to wait because he had work to finish. It wasn't defiance or heroism or even ignorance. It was something much simpler and much more incomprehensible. It was responsibility. The entity pressed deeper into Daeun's mind, trying to understand this bizarre priority system. What it found was a man who genuinely cared about doing his job well, not because he thought it would save the universe, but because someone was counting on the communication network to work properly. There were people on Earth waiting for messages from their families on Mars. There were scientists sharing research data. There were supply shipments that needed coordination. All of these things seemed impossibly trivial compared to the cosmic forces at play, but to Daeun, they were the most important things in the universe. Something extraordinary was happening inside Velnara's ancient consciousness. For the first time in its eons-long existence, the cosmic entity was experiencing an emotion it had never felt before. It wasn't fear, anger, or confusion, though it had felt plenty of those recently. This was something entirely new, something that took the entity several moments to identify. It was respect. These humans weren't just surviving its presence, they were doing something far more remarkable. They were treating a cosmic threat the same way they treated bad weather. They acknowledged it, they adapted to it, but they absolutely refused to let it stop them from doing what needed to be done. It was like watching people continue their daily routines during a thunderstorm, closing windows and grabbing umbrellas, but never considering that the rain might be a reason to stop. Living their lives, Velnara decided to visit one more human facility to confirm what it was beginning to understand. The Ceres asteroid mining operation was one of humanity's largest industrial complexes, a sprawling network of processing plants, refineries, and worker habitats built directly into the surface of the dwarf planet. Nearly 10,000 people worked there, extracting precious metals and rare earth elements that were essential for human technology throughout the solar system. The facility operated 24 hours a day, with 3 shifts of workers keeping the massive operation running smoothly. The work was dangerous and demanding, requiring constant attention to safety protocols and equipment maintenance. A single mistake could result in explosions, toxic gas leaks, or structural collapses that could kill dozens of people. Factory supervisor Kang Mina was overseeing the evening shift when Velnara arrived. She had been working at the facility for 12 years, starting as a basic technician and working her way up through sheer competence and an ability to stay calm under pressure. She was the kind of supervisor who knew every worker by name and could diagnose equipment problems just by listening to the sounds the machines made. When Velnara manifested its presence throughout the facility, the effects were immediate and dramatic. Mining equipment began malfunctioning as the entity's cosmic energies interfered with delicate electronic systems. Conveyor belts stuttered to a halt. Processing units started displaying error messages that made no sense. The facility's main computer systems began struggling to maintain basic functions. More importantly, the workers themselves were being affected. Velnara's psychic presence was filling their minds with primal dread, the kind of deep instinctual fear that had kept early humans alive when they were prey animals on the African savanna. Some workers froze at their stations, unable to move as visions of cosmic horror flooded their consciousness. Others began hyperventilating, overwhelmed by terror they couldn't understand or explain. But Mina had dealt with industrial accidents before, situations where panic could turn a manageable problem into a deadly catastrophe. She immediately activated the facility's backup systems, switching to redundant power sources and manual control systems that weren't affected by the electronic interference. Her fingers moved across the emergency control panel with practiced efficiency, rerouting critical operations and shutting down non-essential equipment to prevent damage. Then she opened the facility's first aid stations and began distributing anxiety medication to workers who were struggling with the overwhelming fear. She moved through the facility calmly and methodically, checking on each person individually and making sure they had what they needed to function. Everyone experiences stress differently, she explained to Velnara, speaking to the cosmic entity the same way she would address any visitor to her facility. Some people panic when they're scared, some people shut down completely, and some people just push through it. That's normal human behavior. We plan for it. She gestured around the facility, where workers were slowly getting back to their tasks as the medication took effect and the backup systems stabilized operations. The important thing is that we've got work to do either way. These metals aren't going to mine themselves, and there are people throughout the solar system who are counting on us to deliver. A little cosmic terror isn't going to change that. Mina paused to check a status display, noted that production, Line 7 was running slightly behind schedule, and made a note to assign extra staff to catch up. You're definitely the most unusual workplace hazard we've ever dealt with, but the basic principles are the same. Identify the problem, implement solutions, and keep the operation running safely. Understanding finally dawned on Velnara, like the first light of a new star being born. After millions of years of existence, after traveling between countless worlds and encountering thousands of different species, this ancient cosmic entity was learning something completely new about the nature of intelligent life. These humans weren't fearless. That wasn't what made them special. Fear was a perfectly reasonable response to cosmic horror, and Velnara had sensed plenty of it in human minds throughout its visits. What made them remarkable was something far more profound and inexplicable. They were endlessly, stubbornly practical. They looked at problems, even impossible problems, and immediately started thinking about solutions. Where other species saw overwhelming terror, humans saw workflow disruptions that needed to be managed. Where other civilizations saw the end of everything they had ever known, humans saw scheduling conflicts that required backup plans. It was like they had collectively decided that the universe's attempts to intimidate them were just another item on their endless to-do lists. Before departing, Velnara decided to seek out one final human to ask the question that had been growing. In its consciousness, the entity traveled to Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, where humans had built a massive freight depot that handled supply shipments throughout the outer solar system. It was a place where the most ordinary humans did the most ordinary work, the kind of people who kept civilization running, without anyone ever noticing their efforts. Tayek had been working at the Europa freight depot for 7 years, managing cargo shipments that supplied research stations, mining operations, and colonies, scattered across dozens of moons and asteroids. It was physical work that required careful attention to detail. One misplaced container could mean that a research station ran out of food or that a mining operation couldn't repair critical equipment. The depot operated around the clock, with massive automated systems moving millions of tons of cargo every day. But the automated systems needed human oversight, people who could make decisions when the unexpected happened. And in space, the unexpected happened constantly. When Velnara manifested near the loading docks, Tyke was in the middle of organizing a complex shipment that needed to reach 3 different destinations on a tight schedule. The entity's presence caused the usual disruptions: electromagnetic interference that made some of the automated systems glitch, and a wave of cosmic dread that pressed against the edges of human consciousness. "Your species intrigues me," Velnara admitted, its voice carrying a tone of genuine curiosity rather than cosmic intimidation. "I have traveled across the galaxy for eons, and I have never encountered anything like you. What drives this persistence? In the face of the impossible, what makes you continue working when confronted with forces beyond your comprehension?" Tyke paused in his work, setting down the cargo manifest he had been checking. He was covered in sweat from the physical labor of moving heavy containers, and he took a moment to wipe his forehead with the back of his hand. The question seemed to catch him off guard, as if he had never really thought about it before. "Someone's got to do the job," he said simply, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating an obvious truth. "These supplies need to get where they're going. There are people counting on them. The research station on Titan is waiting for replacement parts for their atmospheric processors. The mining crew on Vesta needs medical supplies. The colony on Ganymede ordered food shipments that are already 3 days behind schedule." He gestured around the depot, where other workers were continuing their tasks, despite the overwhelming presence of a cosmic entity. It's not about being brave or stupid or anything like that. It's just that the work needs to be done, and we're the ones here to do it. Might as well be us. As Velnara prepared to depart for the galactic core, it made a decision that surprised even itself. The entity had never before left gifts for the species it encountered. Usually it simply moved on to the next world, leaving behind only destruction and terror. But these humans had taught it something valuable about the nature of courage and persistence. The entity left behind detailed blueprints for quantum technology that was thousands of years ahead of human science. Not as tribute to conquerors, but as tools for a species that had shown an ancient cosmic force, something new about what it meant to be truly alive.